This is the second in our session of Bible studies, Lenten Bible studies, looking at the passion stories, the passion narratives in the four Gospels. We started last week with the first of the Gospels, not the first in as it is in the Bible, but the first that was written, which was Mark, written again around 70 AD, and just to remember, that's about 40 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Because of our technical problems, I wasn't with you for the end of the reading, but as you read through, we finished. I fell off when Jesus had just finished the prayer in Gethsemane, and he was. He was then arrested. The Peter, is it Peter who cut off this?
Yes.
Slave? Yeah, the ear of the slave of the high priest.
Yeah.
And then I think where we ended was that weird, at least where I fell out, was that weird verse 51 and 52 about the guy who, an unknown, who ran away naked.
Naked, yeah.
What's that got to do with anything is pure mystery. But it must have meant something to Mark. We just don't know what. So then we had, you read about Jesus before the council, and the narrative of Peter denying Jesus 3 times. Remember earlier at dinner, Jesus, Peter had said, when all these things happen and everybody else deserts you, I definitely will not desert you. And Jesus said, oh yeah, right. Before the evening is over, you'll deny me 3 times. And of course, that is what happens. And that chapter, or that sequence, or that little story, we call these pericopes. That's kind of it's a word that means a story that kind of stands by itself, but it's part of a much larger story. And so pericope you can usually think of as a paragraph or 2 that's a compact story. So in this pericope, Peter denies Jesus the 3 times. Then Jesus goes before trial with Pilate. You remember that Pilate is the Roman, essentially the governor of the province of Judea, which is a province of the Roman Empire. And Pontius Pilate is the emperor's personal envoy and governor, who's responsible for maintaining order, including a justice system in this territory. Is there anything in your as you read about the trial of Jesus and the mocking by the soldiers and so on? Is there anything that kind of raised questions for you, or an aha or something like that? Anything in there?
So
Not
we did
tonight, but
not.
when
We did not read chapter 16. We waited.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, and we're not going to go there today either. We'll do it. We'll do the resurrections after Easter. We'll do the four resurrection versions. So the crucifixion of Jesus starts at verse 21, and it's it's very familiar to us. We've heard it read millions of times, well, hundreds of times maybe. The interesting, one of the interesting notes in there is that it's not Pilate himself in Mark's gospel, but they, meaning the powers that be, put a sign over Jesus' head that said, "The King of the Jews." That was intended to do a couple of things. One is to kind of thumb the Roman government thumbing its nose at the Jewish leaders who had turned Jesus over to the Romans. And the Romans are just basically making fun of the people who betrayed Jesus and turned him over to the authorities by labeling him as their king. The other thing that is going on here is that in Mark's gospel, there is a he has several places in the gospel where the least expected people know that he is the Son of God. And kind of one of the big questions throughout Mark's gospel is, could this be the Messiah? And the pious people always conclude, no, he doesn't fit. We know what the Messiah is going to be like, and it ain't what he's doing, what he's got to offer. And it's people like the demons, in this case, Pontius Pilate, or at least the Roman authorities, and that they clearly recognize that Jesus is who he says, who this book claims that he is. Now, I should take that back. Pontius Pilate didn't believe that Jesus was the King of the Jews. No. He wrote that, or had it written, again, basically to mock the Jews. Then at the when we go forward to the actual death of Jesus, it's very noteworthy, and I'm at verse 39. When the centurion who stood facing Jesus, this was the guy, the Roman, basically a captain who was responsible for the crucifixion. He was in charge of the cohort that executed Jesus. When he saw Jesus die, then the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw that this was, saw the way he breathed his last, and he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." Again, you don't expect that the guy who has just executed him is one of the guys who most clearly enunciates the answer to the question, could this be the Messiah? and yet that's who these this confession comes from. Then noting, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, the Marys who are watching from a distance. There's no hint in Mark's version of this, of that Mary, the mother of Jesus, kneeling at the cross of Jesus. That's a later development that we get actually in John's gospel. But then verse 40, there were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. They used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. Remember, we talked about that last week. A number of women, including some who had been cured, such as Mary Magdalene, cured by Jesus. They became his sponsors, you might say, in his ministry in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. Then just to bring this to the close, there is the burial of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. That's where the story ends. And then, as I mean, we know how it turns out. But after Easter, we'll delve in more depth into the 4 Easter or resurrection events. So, any questions about Mark's passion narrative or comments? Okay, then let's move back
This way.
to Matthew. Matthew, remember, was written around 10 or 15 years after Mark, and was an expansion of Mark. Matthew used Mark as his basic template and added stories and sayings that Matthew had investigated or interviewed people, or kind of developed sources, if you use kind of a modern journalism term. There was no such thing back then, but Matthew was trying to make the case throughout his book. Matthew is trying to make the case that Jesus and Christianity are the ultimate
6:20.
what do I want to say? The whole Old Testament coming to fruition, the expectations of the Old Testament coming to fruition. And it's important to Matthew that there is an understanding that the Christians are Jews, that even though by this time in history the Jews and the Christians basically had gone their separate way. The Christians had been kicked out of the synagogues, and Christians for a generation or so tried to maintain their Jewish roots. But there were 2 things that were acting against that. One was that the Jews and the Jewish authorities were hostile to the Christians. They understood Christianity to be some bizarre heresy that had emerged from Judaism. The other thing is that by this stage, Christianity had spread all over the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, and there were now more non-Jewish Christians than Jewish Christians. And they didn't always get along. They didn't always see eye to eye, because a lot of the Christians that had been raised Jewish wanted to maintain continuity with their Jewish roots. And a lot of Christians who had not been raised Jewish said, why do we need to pay any attention to that religion? We have our new religion. And one of the challenges for the leaders of the apostolic church, the church of the first generation or second generation of disciples, one of the challenges was to keep those two factions of Christianity together, and to develop an understanding that held them together. And ultimately, what they came up with was an understanding that Judaism prepares for Christianity, or prepared for Christianity, and that recognizing that Jesus was a Jew raised in first century Judaism, that's where his theological roots are, and also his historical roots. So the church, in spite of the fact that they had been thrown out of the Jewish association, the synagogues, they still wanted to maintain connection with their Jewish roots, and eventually developed a theology that provided the dotted lines the dots to connect the Old Testament to the ministry of Jesus to the ministry of the church. So it was kind of in some ways, the church kind of built backwards. They knew what they were doing because they were rooted in the ministry of Jesus, but then they needed to look back into Jesus' own background, which was in Judaism, to see where they had come from. Does that make sense? Or did I just make your head twist? Or both?
Well,
Any
well,
question?
also,
yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, it seems like you need to have some understanding of the Old Testament before you can appreciate all the prophecies that were carried out in Jesus.
Yes. And Matthew is a genius at telling a story and then connecting it with an Old Testament story. And you'll be familiar with this was to fulfill. This is what Matthew says often. Something happens, and then this was to fulfill what the prophet Isaiah said, or the prophet Amos said, or the prophet Jeremiah said. And so that connection, Diane, is really important, especially in Matthew's gospel. Any other questions specifically as we move into Matthew's passion narrative?
Doesn't matter, but about how old was Matthew when he wrote this?
We have no idea because we don't know who Matthew is. We don't know who any of
None of
the
the dis-
four. No,
Oh, okay.
none of the four or none of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We know nothing or almost nothing about any of them. There is Luke gives us a hint in his sequel, which is the book of Acts. He includes a story about Luke, who is a co-worker with Paul, and scholars believe that there Luke is writing in the first person. He actually says, up until that time, he said, Paul did this and Paul did that, and Peter did this and Peter did that. And then at one point he says, he talks about Luke, and then he says, and we were, and then he tells the story in the first person plural, we, and puts himself into that story. So we think that's who Luke is. As I said last week, Mark, we have no idea. The scholars believe he was writing in Rome, and writing for a congregation or a group of congregations that was not based in Jerusalem. And then Luke, later on, next week we'll get to Luke. Luke was writing to Romans, and specifically to a Roman official, to try to give an orderly account of the ministry of Jesus and the subsequent ministry of the church, and why the church exists. But John is not it. For the Gospel of John was almost certainly not written by the apostle John. We're familiar with Peter, James, and John, Jesus' closest disciples. And that just, it's very unlikely that any of these was written by anybody that we know from the Bible, with the exception of that reference to Luke. Other questions?
I just had one.
Okay, go ahead.
I just had one little thought.
Sure.
People at that time, trying to write, most of them were not highly educated.
Right.
I mean, they came from a fishermen and so forth. And so I don't know, there had to be some melding of some sort, because I don't know if they could have written as much as they did with their.
It's certainly the case that that very few people were literate. It's also worth noting that at that time, and that this may take a little bit of stretching in your mind. At that time, in the Roman Empire, the international language was Greek. And that was a carryover from when Alexander the Great conquered in around 300 BC, conquered what eventually became the Roman Empire and created the Greek Empire. And for 300 years almost, the Greek Empire was in charge throughout the Mediterranean, and we know it for their arts, their literature, and all of that. And it was well developed, including in their colonies around the world. And so they took their language with them all around the Mediterranean. So at this point, again, at this point in history, Greek is still the universal language within the Roman Empire. It's only in the next couple of centuries that Latin emerges as the new, the successor language. It's also worth noting that when Rome became a major power, the major power, the successor to the Greek Empire. Just a tiny bit of history. When Alexander the Great had conquered the whole Mediterranean, the story is told he got as far as India, and he believed that he had conquered the whole world. And the story is told, it's probably apocryphal, but the story is told that he broke down and cried because he didn't have anything else to conquer.
Poor man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk to Putin.
When Alexander died, and he died young, I don't remember, he's in his 30s or 40s, I think, when he died. But when he died, he didn't have an heir apparent. And so the whole empire, the whole Greek Empire, got divided into four. Four of his generals were given responsibility for that part of the empire. And immediately they started fighting with each other. And there was no longer a Greek Empire. There were pieces of the former Greek Empire. And when the Romans began building military strength, especially with Julius Caesar, they were able to pick off all of those kind of sub empire and put them back together into a Roman Empire. But the Romans were culturally way inferior to the Greeks. It would be like some I mean, this is a huge exaggeration, but some illiterate tribe in Brazil taking over the United States. And, they know nothing about any of the stuff that makes a great empire, in this case, a great country, run. What the Romans did was they really stole from the Greek Empire. And early Roman literature, early Roman statues, paintings, they're all just copies of the Greek, the classical Greek. And it's only in the 200s, 300s, even 400s that the Roman Empire begins to be what we think of it as being, universal and strong and culturally rich and all that kind of stuff. But it took them a couple of generations or even a couple of centuries to establish that, including establishing their language as the universal language. Interestingly, that lasted for almost 2,000 years. You know, a lot of legal stuff is still packed with Latin phrases, and that came into the rest of the empire from Rome. Any questions up this point? So kind of keep in mind that this that at this point, although the Romans are in charge, they are not culturally and in terms of literature, they are not the superior breed that they later become. Any questions? Let's start. Traditionally, the Passion narrative begins with the entry into on Palm Sunday. In Matthew's gospel, there's a whole lot of teaching of Jesus after he comes into Jerusalem, and we're going to skip over that to get to the actual Passion narrative itself, the arrest and so on. But it's worth going back to chapters. What are they? All the way back to 25 and 24. Jesus comes into Jerusalem at the beginning of chapter 21. So we're going to skip the 2 chapters that has him teaching in Jerusalem and go actually 3 chapters and start at chapter 26.
No kidding.
Okay.
My version has, back to the olden versions. Mine has the red for what Jesus is saying. As the red.
Yes, the red print edition.
And it's all red.
Yeah. And that's interesting, and that's an important contrast to Mark. If you go back, if you look in your that's called a red letter edition. Is everybody familiar with that?
No. Yes.
A red letter edition is where the editors have taken all the words of Jesus and put them in red. But if you contrast, for instance, Mark, one of the things I told you last week in Mark is one of the things that Mark does over and over again is say, Jesus began to teach his disciples, and then Mark tells us about a miracle. Whereas in Matthew, there's lots and lots of places where Jesus began to teach his disciples, and then there's paragraphs and paragraphs of his teaching, including a lot of parables, just a whole lot of teaching of Jesus that is not included in Mark's gospel. So you're right to point out that in Luke, in Matthew, there'd be a whole bunch of red in these chapters right before this. Someone want to start reading at chapter 26. And actually, before you do, I want to begin with when Jesus, this is the verse 1 of chapter 26, when Jesus had finished saying all these things. So that's those couple of chapters beforehand that are just teaching. There's a theory that Matthew carefully constructed his book so that it would be kind of a parallel to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that there are 4 teaching sections in Matthew's gospel. We're not going to read any of them. They're earlier than where we're going to start, but that there is that Matthew was intending to present Jesus' teachings as the new law. That was the term that they used for the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah is the other term that we use for it. And we usually translate that as the law, but it's better understood as the teachings. And in the Old Testament, that those 5 books are the ones that have the main teachings that God has for God's people. Now, Jules, if you want to start at chapter 26.
When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." Now, while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum, and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring the ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, whenever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her."
Okay, let's stop there for a second. That should have sounded familiar because that was almost word for word
verbatim, yeah.
from Mark. Mark, however, identifies this woman as Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been, Jesus had cast out 7 demons. So it's interesting that Mark has a detail that Matthew chooses to leave out, and it's just a woman. It's still interesting, I think, that Matthew identifies the host as this dinner is at the house of Simon the leper, presumably formerly
Yeah.
the leper.
One he had cured.
Right, exactly. And then this verse 13, "Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her," is I think just I mean, we still talk about it. That's kind of his point. Even in 2024 in Mount Prospect, Illinois, they're going to be telling the story of this, what this woman did.
Right.
Go ahead, Jules, with verse 14.
Then one of the 12, who was called Iscariot, went to the chief
Please.
priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver silver. And from that moment, he started to look for an opportunity to betray him.
Jules, can you move closer to the microphone, wherever the microphone is? Thank you.
Yeah,
Keep on going.
but bad angle.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. I just love the way Jesus says, my friends and I are going to have Passover at your house. Thank you for the invitation. Keep going, Jules.
When it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so."
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Matthew makes this a little bit more dramatic. The actual dialogue between Jesus and Judas. In Mark, it was kind of noted, but it wasn't like scripted like this. Keep going, Jules.
While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and that after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Both in Mark and in Matthew, this Lord's Supper, the institution of the Lord's Supper, takes place at the celebration of the Passover meal, and an important understanding of what was going on there is that Jesus is celebrating the at that time it was the most important Jewish holiday or Jewish celebration was the Passover. That was the memorial, if you will, to their being released from slavery or redeemed from slavery in Egypt and being led on their way toward the promised land. The Passover meal back then and still today includes matzah bread, and a cup of wine. And so those would have been on the table. It's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That was there's fairly complex history behind why unleavened, but that's and it's interesting, but it's not particularly pertinent right here. But the what it's pertinent, again, this is both in Mark and in Matthew, is that Jesus didn't say to his disciples, go out to Mount Sinai and find some special flowers that we can, or some special plants that we can use, and go to Syria to find grapes that we can use for this special purpose. Jesus took what was right there, the bread and the wine that were everyday part of life and a part of this ceremonial meal, and gave them a new meaning, attaching the memory of his passion to the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the wine. Does that make sense? The continuity and yet newness that Jesus is introducing.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
I read this and was Judas there when he instituted the Lord's Supper?
It depends on which of the versions you rely on. It's not clear one way or the other. It is, I think, most often the conclusion is that Judas left before the Lord's Supper, and part of that is just kind of our revulsion at the thought that Judas would have received this gift. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I was thinking about that,
Yeah. Welcome, Terry.
Hello, I did my good deed and helped the preschool. I went with a friend to the Texas Roadhouse, so that's why I'm
Good.
so late, but I
Oh.
thought I'd come in anyway.
Thank you. We're glad for both the Texas Roadhouse dinner and you're joining us tonight.
Yeah.
Anything else on the so far? Again, this is very, very very similar to Mark in this paragraph. They're just a couple of little things that are different.
One little thing, I had another little question.
Okay.
Both Mark and Matthew make a point of saying when they had sung a hymn, was there a tradition of singing?
Yes, and there still is. It's called the Haggadah, I think is what it's called. It's part of the traditional Jewish celebration of Passover, and
Okay.
there's a hymn that talks about why all of these things in front of us, why we have the bitter herbs, why we have the salt water, why we have the unleavened bread, and that's the hymn that they're referring to here.
Okay.
That Mark is referring to. That's a good catch, Diane. You want to continue, Jules, at verse 31?
Sure. Well, when they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered."
Okay, let's stop there for a second. there's a good example of Matthew tying something back into the Old Testament. Go ahead.
But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Peter said to him, though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples.
Yeah.
Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and he began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, he went away for the 2nd time and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and take your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.
Okay, keep going.
While he was still speechless, one of the 12 arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs. From the chief priests and the elders of the people, now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him. At once he came up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. So Jesus said to him, friend, do what you are here to do. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place. Of all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way? At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? Day after day, I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Then all the disciples, excuse me, then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
Okay, let's stop. Let's give your voice a break, Jules. Does someone else want to take up at verse 57? Or first of all, are there any questions?
Not a question, but an observation.
Okay.
In Mark last week, it said when the cock crows twice, I mean, when you'll deny me twice,
times.
and in Mark, I think wasn't it just twice? And here it's 3 times. Where are we in Matthew? Is that where we're at? And
Yes.
yeah, wasn't it just twice? You will deny me twice, and then the cock will crow in Mark last week.
Let
Or
me
am-
just double check.
Not important.
Even-
Don't think in Mark, they mentioned the cock crowing twice.
Yeah, truly I tell, this is from Mark. Truly I tell you this night, truly I tell you this day, this very night before the cock crows twice,
Right.
you will deny me 3 times.
But,
Okay.
And
but Matthew does
here
twice.
it was different, right?
Uh,
Or
Yeah, he doesn't mention the cock crowing twice. Just said the cock crows.
no, that's right. Yes.
yeah, okay. So that's interesting that it's like slightly different accounts of the same thing.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And let's see, you probably covered this, but what is the difference in time between the time this was written in Matthew versus Mark?
Mark was written in about 70 and Matthew was written in about 80 or 85.
Okay, so a little bit farther out.
Yeah. Farther out. And Matthew and Luke both have their independent sources beyond Mark
Okay.
that they added to their narratives.
So the thinking then is that Matthew and Luke are more accurate than Mark's account, or
Not necessarily accurate, fuller.
right,
they-
more
they-
detailed? Yeah.
Yes, they fill out
Mhm.
fill out details. And in the case, and just before you came on, I noted that in Mark there's very little of the actual teachings of Jesus. In
Right.
Matthew's just packed with the teachings of Jesus,
Yes.
and including the parables. And
Mhm.
Luke does the same thing.
Oh, okay.
But they whereas Mark says, and Jesus began to teach them and then does a miracle, Matthew says, and Jesus began to teach them and then tells us for
What
a few
he-
paragraphs what it is that he taught.
Yes. Got it. Yep. Okay. Makes sense.
Why?
Thank you.
Why did all 4 of these men write the same story? They just each wanted to outdo the other?
I think they were they had in their possession, you might say, stories and traditions that were not included in Mark's gospel. And so Matthew decided to expand on Mark's gospel. Luke also
Okay.
decided to expand on Mark's gospel. Those two probably didn't know each other or know that that Luke and Matthew were not like competitors. They were in different parts of the empire, kind of doing the same thing, taking the original gospel, which is Mark, and adding material that they had gathered.
Okay.
The one complicating difference or complicating factor is that both of them seem to have had access to a collection of Jesus' sayings. And scholars believe that that was a written collection of Jesus' sayings, and that they each drew from that resource, that collection, and took parts of it and put it into their update, you might call it, of Mark, their expansion of Mark. So they had Mark, they had the materials that they had gathered independent of Mark, and then they also had this theoretical collection of sayings of Jesus. And I can't tell you exactly how at one time, 45 years ago or so, I could have told you a little bit better how scholars came up with the conclusion that there was this written document that's now been lost.
Ooh.
Maybe it'll be found someday. A copy of it'll be found, perhaps, but for the time being, we don't think any copies exist. But that's each of them drew on those sources.
Previous ones.
Yeah, independent of each other.
Where is-
John, on the other hand,
Yeah,
is entirely different
okay.
and much later. Christianity has kind of gelled and developed a pretty concise theology that John builds into his telling of the story.
Mhm.
Is it
Go
each
ahead.
one for a different audience too?
Yes, in different locations within the empire, different audiences. Like one was Matthew's writing for a mostly Jewish audience, but not Palestinian Jews throughout the empire, trying to make
Mhm.
the case that Christianity and Judaism are still one religion.
Mhm.
Okay. We are past our time. What I'd like to suggest is that we end here and pick up next week, just kind of like we did this week. Pick up with the end part of Matthew, and then we'll get into Luke, and it'll be particularly interesting to in one sitting for us to see the contrasts and the similarities between
Yeah.
Matthew and Luke.
So where did we leave off here?
We left
Verse
off at verse
31.
50, chapter 26, verse
Verse
57 is where we're
Oh,
going to.
57. Okay. Got
Okay.
it. Mhm.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chapter 20.